What's going on, fellas? I believe this is questions number 42. Got a couple of questions from a community post I put up a couple of days ago. And as always, if you have any questions that you would like my opinion on, leave them in the comment section of the community post that I will inevitably put up probably the day before I do the next one of these. So the question, just getting straight into the questions. The first question is, what are some resources you recommend to learn about programming? If you mean specifically for strength training, I've been screaming this from the rooftops for quite a while now. I think that the Juggernaut training systems YouTube videos from a couple of years ago, maybe from 5 to 2 years ago, up until Chad started losing some of his interest in powerlifting, stopped competing it himself, kind of started handing everything off over to the Juggernaut AI side of things, so the less active, not really being as much of an active coach, more of a passive coach and running a business, which is totally fine. He's had a wonderful career, contributed more so than almost anyone else to the global knowledge of programming. So he's welcome to move on, but I will tell you that the videos from that time period where it was his primary focus, either as a competitor or as a very high level coach who has coached IPF world record holders, and very, very high level untested, so a very good flexible system that he's coached small women all the way to untested super heavyweight men, which is a good litmus test that the program is fundamentally sound in terms of its variables, right? It's not just a method that happens to work for most people, it's a true understanding of the variables and how they vary from person to person and how to write an individualized program. So the videos from around that time and the books are also quite good. You didn't say video resources specifically, so I'd also say that the scientific strength principles of strength training book as well as the Juggernaut books are very good. Highly recommend. The next question is, how do you think that people should be able to row as much as they bench? What about vertical pulling versus pressing? Well, I certainly can't. I don't think that there's any reason to do that other than that it sounds nice. I don't think there's any formal evidence to suggest this. Most high-level benchers can't row what they bench, at least not remotely strict. And if it's not being done strict, we're not really testing the strength of the antagonistic musculature anymore. So that doesn't matter, right? So it's like, no matter how we come at this, if we come at this from a performance perspective, to have that high level of a row, we'd probably be having to commit so much training economy to it that it's taking away from the bench press at that point. So from a performance perspective, it doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. I think you should do some pulling, and you should have some level of pulling strength, and I think that is beneficial to the bench press, but a 1-to-1 ratio is kind of arbitrary and made up. And if we went across our whole body, we would have a nightmare of a time trying to even things out, right? Like, do we need to leg extension exactly what we hamstring curl? Or if we go to a more extreme example of internal versus external rotation at the shoulder, for internal rotation, the pec and the lat are both contributors to internal rotation, whereas there's only a couple of small muscles that contribute to external rotation. So it's nearly impossible if you train in any reasonable way to match those 1-to-1. So it's like, if we need to take that rationale of 1-to-1 antagonistic to like primary mover strength, we're never going to make it very far, because sometimes the cards are kind of stacked against one side or the other in terms of the anatomy of the musculature. It just doesn't line up, right? So I think you should train, right, external rotation if we have these strong internal rotators. I think we should train pulling if we're doing a lot of pressing. I think we should train knee flexion if we're doing a lot of squats or knee extension, right? I think we should include these in our programs, but any specific ratio is kind of made up and it can vary greatly individual to individual. Some people do 2-to-1 pulling to pressing and that works well for them. For me, that would be a tremendous waste of time, and even a 1-to-1 is plenty enough for me. And some people, especially very high-level powerlifters, have zero shoulder issues and are nowhere near even a 1-to-1 ratio of pulling to pressing. I do think that it should be present, though. And what I was saying is, even if the other thing is, if we think of it from a health perspective, if there's, we have this big strength imbalance, that means we have a propensity towards injury. Well, then anyone who's good at bench pressing is going to have this huge propensity towards injury because they're not going to be able to barbell row as much as they bench. It's just not feasible. Like I said, sometimes you have the cards kind of stacked against you in one direction or another just based on muscular anatomy, right? So it's like trying to bang our head against the wall, trying to fix that is not a good use of time. The next question is, what cues do you use when you barbell overhead press? That's a good question. Let me run through them in my head. I don't do much in-person coaching. I've never done that much in-person coaching. So teaching people how to do lifts is not the side of coaching that I'm super familiar with. I have how I do them, and then I have the advice that I give my lifters, and most of my lifters are intermediate to advanced guys, so they already kind of have something that's working for them. I just suggest changes as far as how we might tailor it to be a little bit more optimal. But as far as teaching the motion itself, I come up to the bar, I set my hands, I squeeze the bar, right? Try to like activate our wrist extensors, wrist flexors, create some stability there. Then I will squeeze my scaps together. I don't really squeeze them up or down, just back. So I retract my scaps pretty hard. I get a big breath of air, and then I will come under the bar and I will be squeezing my elbows together as if I was trying to touch them together like this, to some degree. Not super exaggerated, but that way, instead of holding it kind of awkwardly like this, where the weight is kind of floating here, we can create some stability by stacking our tricep on top of our lat, on top of our forearm, squeeze it in, create a stable bottom position, and then I hold my breath all the way through the walkout, and then I begin the press and I start driving my chin forward. That's a big part of how I do it. I leave my eyes up to some degree, but I do think that as soon as I begin the press, I want to fight that impulse to fall away from the bar. So I'm driving my chin forward. So that way I'm fighting to gain ground as I do the press. Come through. I'm going to recommend that you guys get your head through. If you're an advanced overhead presser, I think you can get to the position where doing this is not a task and not necessarily press your head through, just to make the reps more fluid. But if you're not an advanced overhead presser, I would not recommend not getting your head through every single rep. I would definitely make that a habit, because a lot of people will cheese themselves and they'll press it way out in front of them like this, right? And it's like you get these inflated rep PRs that don't translate to a 1 rep max at all, because you weren't actually in a position where you could have finished that lift. You were just relying on momentum that you were able to create with a submaximal weight and not ending in a sustainable end position. Not a great idea. So let's see, and then I would probably get more air at the top. That would be my cues, I guess. Sorry for having to walk through that as I go, but I don't really teach it very often. Once I have a home gym, I'll probably make some tutorial videos on how I like to do certain lifts. I'm going to be very coy and be like, start every single video with, this is how I personally like to do it, because I know people get railed on the internet for suggesting there's one way to do things, and that's not what I'm doing. Just showing you how I like to do them as someone with very little experience in biomechanics, just anecdotal experience lifting. The next question is thoughts on doing volume inversely, i.e. 10 triples with lower rest times as opposed to 3 sets of 10. So that's going to end up probably taking about the same amount of time. The big benefit to Chris Bridgeford, very high level lifter, you should follow him on Instagram if you don't. He lived in Washington at the same time I lived in Washington, and I talked to him briefly, and he is really big on what he calls inverting the volume. So just flipping the reps and sets, as you mentioned, taking shorter rest. And one of the big benefits to this is you're forced to do more first reps, which is the most important rep if we're trying to develop our 1RM, because we don't get a negative beforehand on a 1RM necessarily on like a deadlift, for example. So we have to practice the setup more times. So it probably prepares us better technically. I think that it's not something I would ever consider for purely hypertrophy, non-skill based work, but for skill based motions, it can be a very good way to get a lot more first reps in there. And some people prefer it. I hate slogging through 10 triples. I've tried it. It works very well. I just don't enjoy doing it. So take that for what you will. And then, yeah, I guess that would be the main thing is, hey, if you have a demand for practicing the first rep more times, I think it's a very practical way to do it in like one of your early block phases where you might hit 3 sets of 10 on your squat, bench, or deadlift to just start laying some hypertrophy foundation. Instead, what we do is we come out there and we invert the volume, but take the exact same load that we would do otherwise. So I'm not opposed to it. I just don't like doing it. The next one is from a hypertrophic standpoint. Is it best to train with a lower volume if you're just using a barbell in order to minimize fatigue to stimulus ratio? You can't minimize a ratio. It stays the same no matter how much you do. But I just assume you mean limit the fatigue versus machines where you can get away with higher volumes because of it having a better stimulus to fatigue ratio. I don't know if you can make that statement. I'm sure there's some machines out there that have a horrible stimulus to fatigue ratio. So I think that it's probably dependent on the individual and the exercise. For some people, they can barbell bench press till the cows come home, and it has a great stimulus to fatigue ratio as it doesn't really bang them up. Other people might find that it really gives them elbow issues and they have to be more considerate with their volume. But I don't think that just because you're using a barbell, you should make that consideration one way or the other for everything. I think it should be on a case-by-case basis and say, oh yeah, for me, squats don't bang me up all that much. I can recover from them quite well. Thus, for me, they have a good stimulus to fatigue ratio. I'm going to do a lot of them, and vice versa. Maybe deadlifts don't. And at that point, you can also play around with customizing the motions a little bit, maybe, especially if you're bodybuilding, right? Because you said from a hypertrophic point of view, maybe we are front squatting, maybe we're high bar squatting, maybe we are doing rack pulls, maybe we're doing RDLs instead of our deadlifts, and selecting motions that for you personally have a better stimulus to fatigue ratio. The next one is, what is your ideal mindset when going into either a heavy top set or a 1RM, near 1RM attempt? I know this is something that differs from person to person, but I'm curious what your mindset and mental approach is. That's a great question. Like you said, it's going to vary greatly from person to person. Some people really get really negative with it, and that yields great results. They get pissed off about something from work. Some people need supreme confidence coming in. Some people need to come in calm. Some people need to come in fired up, depending on where they fall on the arousal curve. And it's changed a lot through my lifting career. I can say that generally speaking, being higher up on the arousal curve is good for me. You know, the more fired up I am, usually the stronger I feel, with the exception of maybe the deadlift where I will botch my cues if I get too fired up and nervous. I'll forget something. But as far as bench press and squat go, historically, the more fired up I've gotten before the lift, the better the lift itself has gone. As far as the mental headspace kind of thing, I try to just get blindly fired up. I don't want to be upset. It seems like no fun. I just want to get hyped up, right? Adrenaline. Not really positive, not really negative, just fired up. And that's usually when I'm in my best spot, is when I feel confident. I'm like, hey, I've done a lot of work for this set. I've hit sets that indicate to me that this is something I can do, so I'm pretty sure I can do it. And I'm fired up. And then sometimes it will work well if I'm really just curious to see if I can do it. Sometimes that's enough to get me really excited to do a set. It's just, hey, I think I might be able to do this. Let me see if I'm wrong for a heavy set. That's sometimes a really good mindset for me to go into it, because I'm not super overly invested. It's just I'm amped up because I'm really curious to see if I can pull it off. And that's always been a really good mindset to come into a lift for me, though I can't necessarily duplicate it all the time. The next one is, what is a good way, other than simply getting used to heavy singles over time or doing something similar, to tone down anxiety before PRs or heavy sets? I am plagued by this on the bench after coming back from a minor shoulder injury about a month ago of no benching over 185. So you kind of checked off the best answer with hitting submaximal singles and gradually inching those up there. They don't have to be hard. Just like, that's not even the real workout. We're just getting a touch in at 185, and then you back down to some volume. And then next session, you get a touch in at 190. And that's the easiest way to build confidence, especially if those singles aren't that hard and we build into it. It depends on, like, if 185 is gonna be hard, maybe even introducing the single down at 170. And ramping it up week by week to start getting those heavy touches in. That's the best way to build true internalized confidence. The other thing you can do is really trying to get in the habit of envisioning every weight you do is a heavy weight. That way you've run through it in your mind. If you're really good and disciplined about doing mental imagery training of every time you unrack the bar, it's 2 plates. You're going to feel as though you've already done it when you get to 205. Right, or whatever it might be. But a lot of people don't have the discipline or the consistency to necessarily pull off that strategy, even if it is very effective. If you won't do it, it's not effective, right? So potentially the singles could work quite well as well. The next one is, what is your general approach to programming accessories? Keep it up, Sam and Big Ode. Oh, he's not in here. I'd show you guys Odie, my handsome dog. What's my general approach? Gosh golly, that is a really open-ended question. I'm not sure I can even give you one. If you have something more specific you would like to know, I'm more than happy to answer. I'm an open book. I don't have any secrets. All of my success and the success of my clients is built upon the consistency of executing the basics with small iterations to vary it to a person, and being really just being a dog, right? Doing the exact same thing over and over, right? A dog eats the same 2 meals every day. We eat the same 5 meals every day. And really just going and getting after it over and over and over in a structured and intelligent manner. That's really all it is. So that being said, I know that's all it is. So I'm not going to try to hide anything from you guys as far as how I program. Just let me know what you want to know, because I don't even know where to start on that one. There's lots of different accessories for lots of different reasons. The next one is, what are some good cues to keep tension in the hamstrings and the glutes consistently during RDLs? I have a hard time keeping the consistency rep to rep. Thank you. So maybe drop back the weight, right? If we feel like we're dumping the weight into our lower back repeatedly, it might be just a little bit more than your skill level. You have the strength, right? Maybe more than your skill level on the motion. We're trying to target the hamstrings. We need to execute it a certain way. Maybe you need to drop back the weight a little bit, but as far as cueing goes, I almost retract my scaps. I bring them down and slightly back for an RDL to really lock in, maybe even more of a neutral to extended back position than I would ever deadlift from, to really target the hamstrings in a more exaggerated way. Most people would probably feel like shit doing them, but technically doing an arched back RDL is like the most extreme way you could train your hamstrings. Not that I recommend doing this, but just anatomically speaking, you're gonna get the most stretch in a like interiorly tilted arched position. So maybe really locking the scaps back. We're going to lock the ribs down, so we're not going to be an extension. We're going to just try to lock in a really nice neutral position. So we go scaps back and down. We go ribs down. I don't think you should be locking your scaps back necessarily on the deadlift, just down to neutral. So not forward necessarily for a beginner, not back and down, just straight down. But as far as an RDL goes, we're probably exaggerating the motion, especially if we're starting it from the top out of a rack. We can really kind of retract our scaps to get it out, lock down the ribs, set a good brace, and then after that, it's just a matter of taking your hips and really trying to reach as far behind you as you can with your butt, right? As if you're trying to touch the wall behind you with your butt, no matter how far away it is. If we can really exaggerate that lateral hip travel, the demands on the hamstrings are going to be very significant. So I'd say that's the biggest things and how I personally go about doing it, though I'm not the most prolific form coach in the world. I just have the ways I like to do things. The final question is, when trying to bring up conditioning, specifically for strongman, do you find a little something at the end of the workout, i.e. moderate, farmers, yoke, sandbag, keg, etc., or having 1 to 2 dedicated days to focus on it per week? So I'm going to tell you this. There's lots of great athletes that like doing conditioning with strongman work. I think that if you're pushing your weight training hard, like your true strength training side of your strongman preparation, you're building that basic strength in the squat, overhead press, deadlift. Probably those are the big 3 as far as static lifting goes for strongman. If you're really pushing that stuff hard enough and you're doing a bit of your heavy events now and then, I don't think that building conditioning with the events is going to be smart, because you're already going to have a lot of global joint fatigue. Doing a conditioning method that's going to add more to that just means you probably could have been doing more of the strength training side of things. So I kind of think that in a lot of ways, the fatigue to stimulus ratio, I guess, if we want to get into that, of doing conditioning using strongman events, I don't like it. I would rather focus on the skill aspect. So I hit my heavy strength training, I go do some skill type work, or if I'm getting closer to a show, some heavy skill work on the event itself, so I'm maximizing my skill and technical proficiency at the event. Because if you're doing it for conditioning, you're going to get sloppy and you're not going to be focusing on your cues and getting really efficient at it. What I would like to do instead is we got our main barbell lifting, our strength type shit, however you like to go about doing that. We have our event practice for whatever our week events are, or whatever the events in your upcoming show are. And then we end it with, or we begin the workout with dedicated conditioning work that's not going to add that much systemic fatigue. If you're skilled at the events, you're strong from your barbells, and you're in good shape, you're going to be able to apply that to events all you want. So what I would recommend is selecting a conditioning modality that isn't going to bang you up, whether that be high incline walking for a steady state session, it could be HIIT sessions on a wind bike, anything that does like low impact, low joint fatigue that lets you push yourself pretty hard to get in legit good shape for strongman. The rower, the wind bike, incline walking for greater times, biking for greater times, any of these conditioning approaches, whether you want to do low intensity steady state or you want to do high intensity interval training, Either of these things can be done well, so it's largely personal preference, but you kind of break your training into those three categories. We have our base strength part of it, we have our event skill and eventually heavy event part of it, and we also have our conditioning. I like to do these things separately rather than try to do a bastardized version of two of them at once and take away from any of the other ones. This conditioning session can be done in the morning. This conditioning session can be done as a warm-up for your main workout. It can be done at the end, or it can be done on your rest days. I generally find that if someone's got a real conditioning deficit, fixing that is the best thing they can do for their training, because they can just train that much more by getting into good shape. And then I think it should be done a little bit every day rather than the kind of wreck yourself on your rest day with conditioning and then do nothing, wreck yourself again. Doing a little bit of that every day, I think, drives a better systemic response in terms of getting in better shape again. So that's all the questions. Thank you guys for watching my video as always. Here's your reminder that I keep forgetting to say at the beginning, to like the video. I often get more comments than likes, which I appreciate the support in that regard. But likes also, I think, help me in the algorithm or whatever. And I'm trying to get YouTube to pay me money. So thank you guys for the support as always. I appreciate all of you.